that's what we're waiting for. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out. What a pleasure it is to have our friend S.J. Rozan, who we have been together since your very first book.
Since my first book, yeah.
I know. And now here, how many books is this now?
This is 19. The Murder of Mr. Ma is number 19.
Awesome. Right. So thank you, virtual audience, for joining us. And we're going to talk about The Murder of Mr. Ma, which is the new book, in which we have like 4 copies left. So it's sold very well. But we're also going to talk, because we didn't have a chance to talk to Shira live, about The Mayors of New York, which was her last book for Bill and Lydia. And we're also going to talk about one of my favorite series ever, which are that's a really weird cover for that book. They used to look more like a hard case crime book all of a sudden than it did. Oh my God, look at this one. Okay, well, anyway, imaginative new covers for Judge Dee, who was in fact a Tang dynasty, which is the 7th to the 9th century, a real judge in China who left behind, what did he leave? Notes, stories? What was it?
The judges were their own investigators, and so
Right.
they all left notes and stories and stuff. But Judge Dee was remarkable for never not solving a case. He always, like the Canadian Mounties, he always eventually got his man or woman. And there were a couple of other judges as famous as that, but his stories and the way he did his investigations, his intuitive and deductive reasoning were particularly special, and so they were written down. My theory is that he was real in the same sense as Robin Hood. There was a real guy, but not all of this actually happened. But they say it did, so maybe it did.
Well, the Chinese were bureaucrats to their fingertips. In fact, that's how you got to be a judge, was rising through the bureaucracy. So this particular book, which is The Emperor's Pearl, which really has a weird cover, all begins on the night of the Puyang dragon boat races in 699 A.D. And the reason that we have them is Robert van Gulik was a Dutch diplomat who was stationed in China. No, he was in Japan, wasn't he? Was it China?
He was in China and in Japan, and I think he did the translations maybe in Japan.
Maybe. Well, anyway, he was an authority on Chinese history and culture, and he decided that he would bring Judge Dee to life, and so he wrote this wonderful series of books. And happily, they have stayed in print from the University of Chicago now. And what's fun is that they have these really nifty drawings in them, which I think I showed you, which is kind of, it's illustrative of how, in theory, if people didn't actually look that way, at least the dress is fairly accurate. And if you were to go like to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, where they have Chinese pavilion, you can see how accurate Van Gulik was, because they brought in Chinese artisans to create the pavilion and to do the landscaping and the whole bit. And Judge Dee was spot on in these illustrations here.
And some of these are Judge Dee's cases translated by Van Gulik, and then he went on to just write more stories because he was so fascinated by the character.
And he stayed in voice and did great things. And the reason this is important is that in The Murder of Mr. Ma, miraculously, Judge Dee appears in 1920s London. So
what can I tell you?
Right, and if you don't know about Judge Dee, that whole thing is kind of wasted on you, right?
Well, yeah, we're hoping that people will become interested. If not, then what you have is a Chinese jurist coming to London in 1924 and he meets up with a Chinese writer named Lao She, who actually was there. If you regard them both as fictional characters, like Holmes and Watson, that's fine. If you know that they were both real, just from different times, Lao She actually was there in 1924, but Judge Dee obviously was long gone. But if you know about their history, then some of what happens in here is more interesting.
Absolutely true. So you have a co-author for this book who is not actually present this evening, but tell us a little bit about him. Was Mr. Ma, the murder, was it his idea?
Yeah, during the pandemic, I got a call from my agent, who had gotten a call from John Nee, whom he didn't know, but he got in touch through a mutual friend, Alex Segura, knew John from the comics world. John was publisher at Marvel Comics at the time. He'd come over from DC, but Marvel is owned by Disney, and during the pandemic, Disney was making a fortune on the movies because everybody was streaming everything, but nothing on the comics, the physical books, because they have to be bought in stores, and there weren't. The stores were all closed, so they furloughed the comics people. And John's mind is like an explosion in an idea factory. Things just go shooting off in all directions, and he had these ideas for book projects that he'd wanted to work on for a long time. So he called he called Alex and said, "What should I do?" And Alex said, "Call my agent, and talk to him and see what happens." And he did. And the agent called me, and he said, "I have just spoken to this guy for about an hour and a half, and I think maybe he's crazy. But besides that, I think he has an idea that would work really well for you. Will you talk to him?" So this is like 2 months into the pandemic. I will talk. Will I talk to a stranger with an interesting new idea that I don't know? Why wouldn't I? I'm talking to the walls anyway. So he called me and we talked, and he explained the idea 3 or 4 times. I had to, because he talks like this, and I didn't really get it until he sent me the outline, and then I got it. Yeah, he wrote a 16-page outline, single-spaced, and then I got what he wanted. And what he needed is a narrative writer. He can shape the arc, he can shape the smaller arcs within it. He can't write a narrative sentence. He can't write dialogue.
Just does bubbles. Or does he even do those? Does he do any of the dialogue in the comics?
No.
Oh, okay.
He just says, this happens in this scene, and that happens in that scene. Occasionally, I have to email him and say, "John, you have this big fight in chapter 9, which is fine. And then you have chapter 10, they go and do this. But it doesn't say who won the fight. Do the bad guys escape? Do the good guys get hurt? What happened in the fight?" And he said, "Oh, okay." And then he tells me what he thinks happened. So, he just creates a storyline. So I do the dialogue, I do the fun part. I do the dialogue, the characters, and the setting, which I think is, the good stuff.
Well, it is the good stuff. Now, Sharon and I talked about this at Left Coast Crime last weekend, or at least she talked to somebody and I was there. I can't recall exactly how it went down. But I guess it was when we were talking to Lori King. We were there, the two of us talk. Lori is celebrating the 30th year of the Beekeeper's Apprentice, so she created a day of bees, however it went. And so we were the closing act, Sharon and I. And one of the things Laurie asked you was if you had written or choreographed the fight scenes, and you were not able to claim credit.
I cannot. This book is John's idea was we were going to tell the entire history of modern China from the 1920s to the 1980s in a series of books that had a lot of crime investigation and kung fu. I thought, all right, that sounds like a good idea. Why wouldn't you do that? But I told him from the beginning that I don't know kung fu. I could fake taekwondo because I studied it for a while, but kung fu is a very particular art. It has words and labels and movement that you have to know. So we had to find a kung fu consultant, and this was John lives in Los Angeles, so all the kung fu consultants out there are film people. And they will hire actors and work out the scenes, and then that's $10,000 a day. That's nice for the movies, but this is publishing. We don't do that. So I was complaining to someone at a party that I couldn't find a kung fu consultant, and another guy at the party said, "I don't mean to be eavesdropping, but I used to study kung fu down in Chinatown. I live in New York with a guy named Paul Coe. He may be the guy you need." Master Coe. So we got in touch with Master Coe, and he was the guy we needed because not only does he choreograph great fights, but he's really funny, which is kind of the tone of the book. I mean, it's got some serious stuff that it's that it's dealing with, but the tone, the narrative tone is funny. And so these fights, there's one where an entire house is booby trapped, and I told Master Co, just pick out booby traps that you can then conquer, that our guys can conquer, do whatever you want. And he wrote this, wrote all these booby traps that had me actually laughing out loud when I got them from him. Now he writes in the present tense in multiple voices, whoever it is, Then he ran up the stairs, and the other guy was so afraid that and I thought, no, you can't actually say that because you're not in the other guy's head. So I have to rewrite all, I have to make a scene out of it. But the kung fu, he really knows. And it's for the second book, they have a car, and his assistant called me. She said, Sifu wants to know, Sifu is master, Sifu wants to know, can he have weapons on the car? I said,
it's going to be like James Bond.
I said, calm down. The third book, we can put weapons on the car. This, they only just got the car. So, but yeah, he's fabulous. So it's really, John Shen-Yen, S.J. Rozan, and, a big assist from Master Paul Coe. He gets a big thank you in the back.
Isn't it Q? It's not Emma's in Bond. Isn't Q the gadget guy? The car guy, right?
That's right. That's right. Q,
right.
yeah.
So a lot of people have said that this is Sherlockian in nature, but you can tell that there's some James Bondian stuff here. And fairly near the beginning, there's a great prison break, or at least a jail escape. But that wasn't kung fu. So did you write that scene? Because
I wrote that. There's a little kung fu action in there, but mostly it's just a big melee. When it was supposed to go smoothly, and then of course it didn't. And when the melee starts, it's just this guy got kicked and this guy got knocked over and these guys ran away. So yeah, I wrote that. But the other ones, every time you hear about a dragon fist or a tiger claw or whatever,
I love the way they name all those things.
Oh yeah, they all have names.
Right. All right. So why are we in London, and why are we in 1924? Those were conscious choices that you made.
Yeah. London is. Let me start again. The basis of the mystery in this book is that there are a number, 5, I think, 6, 7 guys, Chinese guys in London who came after World War I, where they had been in France with the Chinese Labor Corps, which I had never heard of before John came to me. 160,000 Chinese went to France to dig the trenches and repair the trucks, do all the stuff that to allow the British and French soldiers to fight. And nobody knows this story. And in fact, the British and the French called for volunteers, not military volunteers, but this kind of earthworks and kind of volunteers from all their colonies. So there were also Africans there. There were people from there were people from the Caribbean. But the Chinese were by far the largest contingent, 160,000. They were not supposed to be near the front, but of course they were near the front. It's war, you can't, you look at your contract, it says, I don't have to do this, and meanwhile guys are bombing you. A number of them were killed, but the important thing here is that not only are we sort of telling people this story that people don't know about the Chinese Labor Corps, but after the war, if they wanted to stay in France, if they'd fallen in love with a French girl or something, they were allowed to do that. The French allowed that. But the British did not allow any of them to come to England. Any of them. And so our guys got there in a particular way, and they're there. And
why did they even want to go?
In this case, they wanted to go for the same reason they went to France. They were sending money home. And they thought if they went to England, because there was already a Chinese community there, they could make more money to send home and eventually go home.
Well, and yeah, Britain was the center of banking too, still. It took World War II and later to get rid of that. So, because of the empire and all the rest, there was capital moving all around from London. So that makes sense too.
Yeah. And Lao She was in London at the time, so it made sense to send Dee there, hook him up with Lao, and then they could investigate this series of murders, which starts with one murder, which Dee is of the opinion that the London Metropolitan Police aren't going to care very much about the murder of a Chinese shopkeeper. They're going to assume it was done by another Chinese guy, and that's the end of that. And he is a little suspicious.
So who's Lao She?
Lao She was a writer who died in the Cultural Revolution. He was in his 60s. He might have been 70 by then. He was very famous in China, and then he was not so famous because it was the Cultural Revolution. And now he's been rehabilitated and he's famous again. He wrote books set in the working and lower middle class in Beijing, and he was very, very funny. He wrote a lot of satire. He wrote one book called Cat Country, which was science fiction. And in Cat Country, a Chinese regular guy goes to Mars with an astronaut. He sort of, they didn't even call him astronauts, a spaceman, whatever they were called. He sort of just jumps in the spaceship with the guy and says, "Can I come with you?" And the guy says, "Sure." But they crash land, and so the spaceship is destroyed, and the spaceman is killed, and there is this Chinese guy on Mars, where he is found, and kind of he meets all these large cats, which are the population of Mars. And the entire book is a real biting satire on Chinese culture. Only it's cats on Mars, so you could push it a little farther.
Yeah.
And I am convinced that this is the book that got him killed in the Cultural Revolution, although there's some question as to whether he committed suicide or was murdered. But
Really?
the fact that he was persona non grata, he'd been beaten, his house had been destroyed. So if he committed suicide, it's still the Cultural Revolution's fault. But the word for cat in Chinese is Mao. And in those days, you could not say anything bad about Mao, even if you were talking about a cat. So that might have been the last straw. But he was a very funny man, and I hadn't realized that. I'd heard of him, but I'd never read him until John. When John wanted to do this project, I said, I have to get up to speed on everything, on London in the 20s, and on Lao She, and on Judge Dee I have to reread. And John started sending me books. Books would arrive from the sky, from Amazon and from bookshop.org and from what is Better World Books, which is the used book one. And they would just keep coming. So I read a lot. And he sent me, when he could find them, Lao She. I think he's more or less out of print, but you can find them in used bookstores. And the guy was a stitch. So, but he was also, he seems to have been, if you read him, a little bit clueless, just a little bit. So he makes a great Watson character to the Holmes character of Dee, because he's always just a little bit behind.
Right, which is essential. I mean, that's how when you have a genius, the rest of us get to get inside the mind of the genius by the person who's like us, or maybe even not as clued in as we are. I mean, it's a great concept. There are action partnerships, like Spencer and Hawk, but then there are the genius and the not genius partners, which I think are really fun. So are you anticipating writing more of these and staying close to this time frame? I mean, are you going to stick around to the middle 20s in London?
For a while.
Okay.
We have finished the second one, which takes
good.
place, I have to go home and do the edits, but it takes place 6 months after this. So this is spring 24. The next one is fall 24. And we will be going on probably in 6-month increments for a while.
But, if you ride up into the Depression and then the war, you have to make a decision about how slowly you want to go.
Well, yeah, and I think we do want to go into the Depression and the war, because it is John's idea that the history of modern China, that Westerners don't really know what happened. Westerners have this idea that there was World War II, which wasn't actually fought in China, which is not true, and then there was the communists took over, and then there was a long time when it was just communism, and so the history of stuff that happened is not known in the West, and that's what he wants to show. So we will be going through history, but there's 24 is a 24, 25 are sort of prime years for what was happening in China that had reflections around the world. They're people who were financing things, people who were committing crimes in other places because of stuff that was going on in China. So
Okay.
yeah,
So the Manchu dynasty ended in what, 1911, wasn't it?
yeah. But then came by this time there are two governments and a couple of warlords.
Right.
And that goes on and on. And
The reason I said that is there's a very interesting book called The House of Doors that came out last year, and it has a lot to do with Sun Yat-sen
Yep.
and all the work he did while he was hoping that the dynasty would fall, and then how he sort of put things together. But it was all destabilized, and
all of China was destabilized,
Right.
and it's so huge that a stable warlord in the north could kind of run his own country while everything else was going on in the south.
early China was more than one country. You
yeah,
know,
yeah,
I mean,
through most of its history. Yeah.
right, it was. So it's kind of unusual to have this monolithic China
Yeah.
that we
Yeah.
currently have. All right, so what's the story here now that we've had all this background? What actually happens?
What happens in the murder of Mr. Ma? Dee and Lau meet, and they meet actually through the good offices of Bertrand Russell, who is
Such a cool character, too.
I had such fun with him. Yeah, and he was a cool character. And they start investigating this murder, and then of course there's a second murder, and it becomes clear that there is a pattern of who is getting murdered and how, and it becomes clearer to Dee than to Lau, obviously, earlier. Dee, meanwhile, is addicted to opium, which he was also in France in World War I, and it happened there. And so he has visions. He sees General Lin, if you know Commissioner Lin, who was the one Chinese, he was the author of the one Chinese military battle victory in the Opium Wars, when the European powers were trying to force opium on China. He held them off for a while. And so Dee sees Commissioner Lin, who gives him a very hard time about being an opium addict, but also gives him some useful clues. And they go about trying to find out who is killing these guys. Ezra Pound comes in. We have, does anybody else who's real come in this one? We have a bunch of real people coming in, the next one too. And eventually they succeed because they're heroes. And so that is the basic plot.
Are the victims Chinese?
The victims are all Chinese. Yeah, they're all these Chinese men who the Metropolitan Police are of the opinion that all Chinese, as many people were, that all Chinese in England are laborers. They're probably opium addicts. They should all go home. The Yellow Peril. This was the big Yellow Peril time in the 20s. The Yellow Peril idea had hit the U.S. earlier, but it hit London really big in the 20s. And so, simultaneously with being laborers and opium addicts and they should all go home, they were also all the insidious Dr. Fu Manchu. They were all evil geniuses. And so it really means very little to the Metropolitan Police that these cases are popping up. So that's actually the victims. Yes, they are all Chinese. I tell you, I was about to say they're not, but that was different. Yeah.
Right. Well, I think I mean, it's a lot of fun to read. Did you anticipate the Sherlock Watson thing from the very beginning that people were going to make that analogy?
Yeah. We kind of leaned into it, although John says that he prefers the Poirot Hastings um, analogy, but that's because he likes Poirot as a character better than Sherlock, because Poirot is charming and respectful and he's a nice guy, and Sherlock is not a nice guy.
No, but he's also an addict. So
Yes, he's
you know,
another
there
addict.
is that.
So yes,
There is
there's
that thing
absolutely.
that they have
We
in common there.
Yeah, we did know, and we sort of leaned into it. That was fine with us. That's kind of any genius, slightly dim bulb. And that's the other thing. Hastings is dim, but in a different way. So, but yeah, we did know, and that was fine, and especially in London and in the tail end of the Sherlock era.
Yeah, well, Doyle really quit writing him after the war, if I remember.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
know, he couldn't think of a real good role for Sherlock Holmes in post-war England. Also, he was bored with him. He killed him off once and then had to resurrect him. So, he didn't want to do it again. Was there no other sort of character like that from Chinese history? So Judge Dee, I mean, that's a big jump. That's like 1,200 years then, or
There
whatever it was.
there was another similar judge, Judge Bai, but that he's not as famous.
Okay.
And I think what John was thinking was, once you start moving people around in time, you can sort of move them anywhere.
Well, that's true.
And we are not the first. Judge Dee has been used. There's a French series of short stories that I think takes place maybe 40 or 50 years before this, so
Yeah,
late
I'm trying to
Victorian.
remember whether didn't Jan Willem van Vettering write some Judge Dee?
Oh, he might have.
I think he
Yeah,
did.
yeah.
Although he may have written oh, there was a French series that it's actually been on Masterpiece Theater, Inspector Vandervalk, and Van der Vettering wrote it. But I'm pretty Patrick. Do you remember? Didn't Jan Willem? Didn't he write a Judge Dee thing? I'm sure he did. Yeah. Okay. Stories, wasn't it like a short story collection? Yeah, that sounds right. Yes, he
Oh,
did.
okay.
Yeah, right.
That'll be
So
be
he's
worth
been
reading. Yeah.
Judge Dee has been interesting to quite a few people.
You know who's doing it now is Q Long. The
Q Shalong.
yeah.
Yeah, that's right. He did
Yes,
have him
Yeah,
in
he's got a
his-
new
you're
Judge
right.
Dee out. Yeah.
Yeah, right. I love his books. If you have never read Death of a Red Heroine,
Yeah.
one of my favorite books.
Yeah.
Right. Although by now, I mean, it's historical.
It's historical.
It really
Yeah.
is. And, yeah.
Yeah, his books are set in Shanghai in the 90s. So yeah, by now they are historical.
And I'm trying to remember, was Judge Dee a poet? Because Shalong's
yeah.
Shalong's detective is a poet.
No, the new ones, he's got two Judge Dee books, but they're not related to that series.
Okay. Yeah. So I guess Judge Dee is the Chinese version of Sherlock Holmes. If you want to do that, then you would. Alrighty. Well, tell us about the Mayors of New York, because you have part of the deal with the Bill Smith and Lydia Chen series is they tick-tock back and forth.
Yeah.
It's a Lydia book. It was a Lydia book at the very beginning, and then it was Bill, and you've gone that. But then you made kind of a jump.
Well, there were two Lydia books in a row, but you can't actually say they were in a row because they were 8 years apart. I did other things in the meantime, but then I came back, and so Lydia, Bill, and then here is Bill. And this is the Mayors of New York. The Mayors of New York are the people who actually run New York as opposed to the mayor. They are the woman who sits on the park bench and knows every kid in the community and knows if someone doesn't show up and that kind of thing. The woman who does everybody's taxes and knows everybody's business. The guy who runs a restaurant in a immigrant community, and those are the real mayors. And in this book, the mayor, the elected mayor, New York's first woman mayor, her son runs away. He's 15. He disappears. They don't think it's foul play. He's done this before, and he took a backpack and all, but they would like to get him back before it becomes clear that the mayor's son has disappeared. But they want to do this on the quiet because the police union contract is up for negotiation. And she can't really ask the police to look for her son and then tell them they're not getting a raise. So she hires she hires Bill, and Bill hires Lydia, who has another case that she didn't take, a young Chinese woman from Chinatown, but at a very high-class school uptown, and that young woman has killed herself. And her parents say it isn't suicide, she wouldn't do that. And Lydia says, yeah, parents all say that, and I'm not going to take this case and then get their hopes up and then, find out it is suicide. But of course the two cases are connected because 15-year-olds are all connected. And the greatest thing that ever happened to me is I got a text from my 15-year-old great nephew who said that the 15-year-olds in this book were spot on. I thought,
wow, that's an accolade.
Yeah, that's what I thought. But then they go, in order to find the kid, they go from mayor to mayor, looking for kind of the underground trail.
It's almost like the women who ran the blocks in the Back to Q Shalong and the
Right.
and, the first book that he wrote, because they had the neighborhoods set up in Shanghai under the communists. So there was always like one person, usually a woman, who minded everybody's business, including her own.
Yeah.
So it's kind of along those lines.
Yeah, this is not as organized. It's not official, but it's absolutely true. It's in New York. You can always find the person who knows everything about everybody and is kind of in charge, or likes to think they're in charge sometimes.
Didn't COVID break that up?
Well, COVID broke up the neighborhoods, but
Right.
they recoalesced, so
Oh, yeah?
it's back. Some people are missing. The old lady who sits on the bench might have died of COVID, so they
Right.
need a new old lady. But the idea that New York is really just a series of small neighborhoods, it's still true.
Is it?
Yeah.
Well, good. It's interesting how we all go back to old things, how easily we settle back into old patterns. So the reason they were two Lydias together was your book that went to Mississippi, wasn't it?
Yes.
Which is, I think, fabulous.
Thank you. Yeah. One of the reasons I stopped with the Bill and Lydia's is because I didn't want to be one of those series writers who starts phoning it in. I have a book due. I don't know what to write about, but I have a book due, so I'm going to write a book. And I didn't have an idea. And I did have ideas for the two standalones that I did right in there, the paranormals. And then a friend of mine moved to the Mississippi Delta, and he said, come on down and visit. And I said, boy, is that on the bottom of the second page of my list of places to go. But if you're going to go to some place like the Mississippi Delta, you want to go with a friend. You want to go with someone who knows the entire place, can show you around. He's a photographer, so it's not like he had a day job that he couldn't spend time with me. So I thought, all right, I'm going to do it. And I went down there, and Ace Atkins lives in Oxford, so he came down, and we drove all around and we're seeing stuff. So we go to, he takes me, because I'm a photographer, not like him, but we go to the Jewish cemetery in Clarksdale. He lives in Clarksdale. And I knew there was a Jewish cemetery there because I knew that the Jews had been traders up and down the Mississippi River, so fine. And we're doing photographs of the graves. And Eric said that there's an even bigger Jewish cemetery in Greenville, which we're going to down, it's about an hour south, go down there for dinner tomorrow. And it's, you can do lots of good photographs down there, and it's right next door to the Chinese cemetery. And I thought, wait, the what? there's enough Chinese people in the Delta, they have their own cemetery? I mean, how can this be? He said, yeah, the grocers. I don't even, was that English what you just said? What do you mean? Yeah, the grocers. And I learned the story of the Mississippi Delta grocers, which was kind of extraordinary. That these guys, it started with a couple, well, it goes back to the Civil War, actually, but around the 1880s, because the Delta didn't get cleared and planted in cotton until after the Civil War. So they're clearing, they're draining the swamps, they're planting the cotton, and they realize that if they want the cotton picked, they're going to have to pay somebody to pick the cotton, because they don't have slaves anymore. Oh my God, what are we going to do? And to pay black people to do things that you used to just tell them they had to do did not sit well. And somebody said, that's okay, because you know what? We just finished the railroad, and now the Chinese are all being driven out of the West, so we'll bring them here, and we'll have, they'll pick the cotton. So there was like 24 Chinese who came in that first work gang, and they lasted like one season, and they said, oh no, you're not paying us enough to do this. This is terrible work. But they liked the area. They liked the climate. They were from southern China. They could fish, they could hunt, they could do all the stuff they used to do. And they couldn't go back. I mean, these were the railroad guys. They came over because they were so poor and they were sending money home. So they established stores. They became merchants. They established grocery stores. And then they found out that their best customers were black people who couldn't shop in the white stores. And because it wasn't that the Chinese loved black people better than white people did, they thought anybody who wasn't Chinese was, for the birds. So what's the difference, You let anybody in your store because they're not Chinese anyway. And so they became the grocers to the black community. And it became this symbiotic relationship. They would lend money, and they always got paid back. Very few of the Chinese grocers had anything to complain about with their black customers. And so that was, the grocers. They started sending for, their brothers and their uncles and their wives when the anti-Chinese laws changed, and they established communities, and this was all news to me completely.
To me, when I read your book, I was amazed.
Yeah. So so there I was, and I thought, boy, if I was ever handed a Lydia Chin book on a platter, it's this situation, and if I don't write this book, I will never get another idea in my whole life. So that was why the next book in the series became a Lydia Chin book.
Right. Lydia's there because her mother sends her down there because there's a relative that has been arrested or something, and the mother doesn't believe that any family member could possibly, be a criminal. So that's why Lydia's there. And then the mother, if you've read this series at all, who's never had any use for Bill, decides that Lydia needs Bill as an escort. It's too dangerous for her to leave New York City for the Mississippi Delta, where the population is so thin compared to New York City that probably not as, but still. Anyway, so Bill gets to go with her. So there were a lot of interesting things that happened in that book.
I thought so, yeah. And most of them are based on stuff that actually happened or stories that I heard. I met a number of the Delta Chinese who were really interesting, but also people who live down there who are sort of a little bit sick and tired of the stereotypes of Mississippians, and the Delta is different. When in the elections where all of Mississippi votes red, the Delta votes blue. It's not the same as the rest of them. I mean, it is, but it isn't. And Clarksdale's a really interesting place, and a lot of the Delta is interesting. And I met such interesting people, so I had to put a lot of them in the book.
And we have not. I just had to look it up because I can't remember titles anymore. What is this book actually called?
Paper Sun.
Right. And I have been waiting forever for the publisher to bring it out in paperback.
And they haven't, have they?
No. They have not.
I will get on their
I
case.
frequently mention that, right?
Hmm.
But
I,
they would be a
they're
really good idea if we're going to
yeah,
rave on about this book, if there were actually a book to sell.
they're getting a little recalcitrant there. That publisher. I have to have a talk with them.
Well, their business is to do hardcovers for libraries and stuff. They don't do a lot of paperbacks, but they should,
But they should.
you know, because you don't want a couple of your best books tied up and, you know, and disappear. But I love Paperson. If you can find it, I really recommend you read it. And then you can move on to The Mayors of New York. However, this is a different publisher, The Murder of Mr. Ma, and they're very good about keeping their books in paperback forever. So that's
And
good news.
and it's already on audio, read by the guy who read The Three Body Problem on audio. What a voice! What a voice, and what an ability to do many characters.
Right. So good news is there's already a sequel and probably more books. So anyway, do you have questions? Anybody would like to ask SJ a question?
Yes, ma'am.
The Chinese Exclusion Act here,
Yes.
was there comparable in England? That part of the 24 that you're talking about?
The question is, there was a Chinese Exclusion Act here. Was there a comparable thing in England? There was a some law that prevented women, not laborers, because the laborers would basically come on the ships and then they would come off the ships, and they weren't really immigrants in the same way. But there was a while where women weren't allowed, because then you get families and God knows what could happen after that. But it was not nearly as restrictive as the one here, because they had been, their access through the Middle East, was practically the Silk Road all along. So there had been Asians in England for many years.
And they had an empire that embraced.
Right,
all-
they had an
you know,
empire,
the
right?
British- The British were one of the, the merchants and colonizers in Shanghai, where they all had. And in fact, that's where the opium trade got to China, was that the British wanted tea. And so they could grow opium in what we now call Afghanistan. And then they could take it to China and sell it and acquire tea.
Yeah.
And Chinese porcelain was a big thing too,
Yeah,
but it
yeah.
was really the tea
Yeah.
more than
yeah.
anything else. And, so basically they addicted the Chinese, and in order, British were pretty ruthless commercial. I mean, the British Empire was a business enterprise.
Yeah.
It was, that's why so many of their cities were ports all along, Hong Kong and, Malta and all the rest of it. They were all way stations along the way for their ships to keep sailing.
But so, yes and no.
Oh, there was a lot of Chinese in Louisiana and New Orleans, too.
Really?
I enjoy your books because you brought out things I never knew, like Chinese Schindler.
Yeah, I try to. That's what I like, when I learned this story of the Chinese in the Delta, and I realized I am not the only person who doesn't know this story, but it's a story that should be told. So that's what I like to do that. Yeah. There's a Chinese. There are other Chinese communities in the South, and there is also now a very big Vietnamese community in Louisiana and in Texas. What happens is, what happened with the Chinese grocers. You get 3 people doing something, and they send for their brothers, and the next thing you know, that's where they go, and that's what they do when they immigrate. That's why, in New York, the newsstand business is a Pakistani business, because, a guy set up a newsstand and called his brother, and so on, and the guys with the fake handbags on the sidewalk are Somalis, so it's very much ethnic business.
Sure. Well, it makes sense if you're an immigrant.
Hume also wrote about Chinese in America. A lot of Chinese died in the Civil War. They were already here.
Yes, yeah, from the east, yeah.
Well, I don't think the railroads could have been built without Chinese
No,
labor.
the Chinese and the Irish built the railroads and
The Irish built the railroads in England,
Yeah,
basically. They,
yeah.
you know, more so than the Chinese, but in here in the
In-
West, it was definitely
and
the
it was
Chinese.
yeah, it was the Irish and the
Right.
Chinese, and
They
then
also did in New Zealand. I remember
is
we
that
were in
true?
the South Island of New Zealand. Again, we were surprised to find a Chinese cemetery, and it was comprised of Chinese laborers. And what happened was they came over and they worked, and they sent money to their family, but many of them never married because there weren't any Chinese women, and eventually they couldn't, you know, there wasn't any reason for them to go back to China, so they died in New Zealand and were buried there. And you know,
Interesting. So they built the railroad there.
I don't know exactly what they. I'm guessing that they were. There is a railroad that goes across the Southern Alps from Christchurch over to the other coast, but I don't know that necessarily that's what they might have been there for the gold mining.
Yeah.
You know, because they had some serious gold mining in the South Island of New Zealand. But anyway, they were a labor force. Is basically what they what they came in for. Patrick, are there online questions? I see you lurking over
Yeah,
there.
I'm lurking. There are a few. Let's see. The first one is, did you enjoy Left Coast Crime? There were some
Oh.
people that were there with you.
Oh, I loved it. There was a convention in Seattle that just ended, and it was really one of the best run, most fun conventions. And oh, good Lord, do they have food in Seattle? Oh my God, I meal after meal of fabulous food. Yes, I enjoyed it a great deal.
It was actually not in Seattle. It was in Bellevue,
Yeah.
which is a very new across the bay kind of thing, and apparently geared up, I think, for conventions because it's packed with hotels and packed with restaurants.
Yeah.
We ate in a Vietnamese restaurant, then we ate in a Wild Ginger, and then we had seafood.
I think
But
I
the
ate in that.
hotel was particularly good, I thought, except it didn't have a bar. It did not have a central bar, which was a problem for the crime writing community.
Well, it had that bar downstairs, but
Well,
you
but
couldn't really hang out there. Yeah.
Exactly. But otherwise, the hotel was really first rate, I thought,
Yeah.
for a convention hotel.
And
Is that
very.
By the Gasworks Park?
No, Gasworks Park is actually in Seattle. This
Oh,
is
okay.
It's across the, if you fly into SeaTac, instead of going up to Seattle, you branch off this way.
Okay.
So it's a different thing. But I'm able to tell you, since we did take Tom and Joe Perry to dinner in Seattle, that it's a $180 round trip Uber ride from Bellevue to
holy
Seattle.
cow.
But somebody did the economics, and the parking rate at the hotel was either $35 or $50 a night. So if you rented a car and tried to beat the Uber rate, it wouldn't do that. So my advice is just go to Bellevue or go to Seattle. But it's probably not a great idea to try to do both.
That whole Seattle underground is so fascinating. If
it
you've been
really
on, let's see. You've actually touched on this a bit, but somebody wants to know, how much time have you spent in China?
I've been to China a number of times, and to different parts. So I've been to Shanghai, I don't know, half a dozen times. The Shanghai Book Festival was actually one of the literary festivals. Excuse me. I've been there a couple times, and then kind of every time I go in and out, I go through Shanghai. But I've been to Beijing, and I've been to Xi'an way over west, which is a whole different cuisine. And there's a Xi'an restaurant in Bellevue
was.
that I didn't get
I
to.
remember the 26 dumpling restaurant in
Yes,
Xi'an.
yes,
Rob
yes.
and I forgot that the Chinese eat backwards. And so we thought when we'd arrived at a certain point, that we were done. And so we had more dumplings than discovered. We had like 13 courses to go. It was almost tragic. But I think Xi'an is fascinating.
Yeah, it is fascinating.
And,
Absolutely.
and they
yeah.
also, in Xi'an, they have synagogue and they have mosque. And
Yeah,
they
it's
have,
the old capital. It is.
Yeah,
It
but
was
it's also where the Silk Road kind of starts.
It was the capital of the Tang Dynasty, so that was. Although Dee wasn't there, but it was where the government issued from. And I've been to South China. I've been to Hong Kong a number of times. So I've spent how much time. It's hard to say. It's 8 or 9 trips, but how much actual time I couldn't tell you.
Well, here's a question from our friend Jane Ann Krentz.
Hi, Jane.
Yeah. She
Hi,
says,
Jane.
Jane came over for lunch, so she paid the Uber rate going the other direction. Thank you, Jane.
let's see. She says, greetings to you and Barbara. Tell SJ, Frank and I are waving from Seattle. Two questions. Where does your fascination with China come from? And are you still doing architecture?
The second question, no. I I left the office in 2004, which meant I went back for the next 8 or 9 years because I had some specialties, and rather than they were very boring to most people, so nobody wanted to learn them in the office. And I by the time I left, I was the institutional memory. I'd been there 20 years, and the boss really was reluctant to let me quit. And I had to promise that I would come back if he needed me. So I did that for a number of years. But now I don't do any architecture at all, which is kind of a pleasure in a way, because when I see an ugly building, I can say so, rather than defending my profession. The fascination with China, I actually don't know. And I know that sounds a little mealy-mouthed, but I don't know where that comes from. But what I can tell you is that when I was a kid, there was one Chinese family in the neighborhood. This was a Jewish, Irish, Italian neighborhood, but there was one Chinese family, and they had for dinner, and Eugene was just like, part of my life. So that when I did become interested in China, and this had to be somewhere in high school, because one of the reasons I went to Oberlin for college is because they had such a strong connection with China. So somewhere in there, I became interested. And when I did, it never crossed my mind that Chinese people, Chinese culture, all those words that people use, inscrutable and unknowable and whatever the hell, that never occurred to me that any of that was true. Mr. Lee talked funny, but my grandfather talked funny. He was also an immigrant. It was just a different kind of funny, but you could understand what he said. So none of that bothered me. When I first started looking into, doing the research so I could do Lydia well, I would go down to Chinatown and see what was up, and I would buy stuff, and if they couldn't tell me what it was, I knew it was edible. I mean, they wouldn't be selling it in a food store if it wasn't edible. And I cook very badly, so it sort of didn't matter. I would ruin anything. And I read all the young Chinese writers. I would listen to all the Chinese music and stuff. I took a course in Chinese poetry in college. So I don't know where it came from, but I do know that I was able to indulge it in a way because I didn't feel like I was an outsider, or I didn't feel like I was a permanent outsider in that culture any more than I would have if I'd become interested in Irish culture, Irish music, that kind of thing. I would have, gone and seen where you could hear it and where you could see the clothes and stuff, and that's what I did. So I really wish I knew the answer to the first question, but that is the answer to how come I did it when I decided to do it.
Anything else?
Well, there's a question here from YouTube. Do you ever feel that your hands are tied by writing in another author's universe?
By writing?
In another author's universe.
Oh, that would be the D?
Yeah.
Yeah. No, because we moved them 1,000 years forward. Otherwise, they might be. I would not write in the Van Gulik days.
Right.
It's a lot more than 1,000 years. If you think about it, isn't it?
1924. Well, yeah, because it was it's probably about 1,200 years. But we took the character, but I don't have to worry about one of the things about the original stories is that each that this would be one case, even when it looks like it's not one case. It looks like it's more than one, but it's one. So it's an interesting question, but no.
Was the Dagung An, was that the first book that, you know that Dover reissued it, the first one to feature Judge Dee.
The first one with Dee?
Wasn't it the Dagung An, something like
I
that?
don't remember, to be honest. Let me look.
The type of fiction in which
Yeah,
a
that-
magistrate investigates is called Gong An.
Okay.
So it might be.
I'm just butchering the pronunciation, probably.
Well, if
Alright.
it was D Gong An, it would be
Yeah.
the cases of Judge Dee.
Yes, that's it.
All right, well, here's a list of all of them. There's the Chinese maze murders, Judge Dee at Work, which I think is more stories rather than a whole novel, The Emperor's Pearl, The Haunted Monastery, The Lacquer Screen, The Monkey and the Tiger, Murder in Canton, which wouldn't have been called Canton probably, Necklace and Calabash, The Phantom of the Temple, Poets and Murder, The Red Pavilion, and The Willow Pattern. And Robert Van Gulik actually drew the illustrations in these books in the Chinese style. So I think they're wonderful books. I really do.
Yeah, I agree.
So I'm delighted that they're still in print. Although I have to say, I really don't like the covers. They're
some of
just
them, I
so
mean,
weird. Oh,
This is okay, but yeah.
right. The older ones look like the line drawings, so
Yeah.
you sort of, maybe they thought that this would attract a new generation of readers because they, didn't look historical. Who knows?
Yeah,
Right.
here it is. It was. This is the celebrated cases of Judge Dee.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, also known as Digong An, or is an 18th century Chinese detective novel by an anonymous author.
Right.
So that's
right,
what.
right. And
Van
that's where
Gulik-
von Gulik got them from, these 18th century
Right.
kind of. It was would have been a compilation of the Judge Dee.
Kind of like Grimm's fairy
cases.
tales or
Yeah,
something, you
yeah,
know,
yeah.
that kind of thing. The Tang Dynasty was a real flowering of Chinese culture. Have you ever seen that distinctive glaze? It's kind of a bronze color with a particular green. I mean, it's very distinctive. They were very big on horses. So the Metropolitan in New York has some gorgeous examples of Chinese pottery. I think there's one actually at the Phoenix Art Museum, if I remember it. Yeah. But it was just it was a time of real cultural blossoming. Civilizations do that. They'll have like a period. I mean, the 1920s was a really interesting time in France and in England for artists, and
Yeah.
and maybe it was a reaction to the war, or it had been suppressed during the war, and so it all came up again. Who knows? But anyway, that dynasty was, very culturally fruitful.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, anybody else? One more.
When you were doing your research, did you happen to see the Judge Dee movie? Kind
Yes.
of,
Yeah, the new ones. They call them Detective D. Yeah, yeah. I am not crazy about those. Although, they. I'm sorry.
a lot of martial arts.
A lot of martial arts, which is good, because it kind of sets us up. Because the originals, Judge Dee did not go around punching anybody in any of these, but they seem a little overdone to me, is all. But martial arts movies tend to be overdone.
Where are they showing? I don't think I've run across them.
I don't know how many years ago it came out.
Yeah, there's.
Oh yeah.
I think there's a newish one. They're called Detective D and the whatever. And who is it's a famous Hong Kong director, isn't it?
Well, I'll have to look for it.
Yeah,
'cause
look for them. Yeah.
I'll take a look because anything Judge Dee is better than
Than
nothing
nothing,
Judge
right.
Dee by far.
Yeah.
He has a lot of kung fu and
Yeah, especially the most recent one, right?
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. Probably no dragons, though, because that's sort of the hallmark of, many Chinese movies that Americans watch. I am going to watch Kung Fu Panda 4 tomorrow, just to show you how that goes. I love Kung Fu Panda. I thought it was excellent. Right. All right. Well, thank you all very much for coming
Thank
this
you.
evening.
Thank you.
virtual audience. Appreciate it.
Thank you, virtual
And,
audience.
Let's
Hi,
give
Jane and
SJ
Frank.
a round of applause. Yay. And if you'd like to get your book signed, we'll just you'll just stay here.
Yeah, I'll just sit
put her
here,
at the
yeah.
table, and you can do that. So, now I have to get up again. Wow.
Well, how do you do this?